Okay, I want to welcome you to day 3. So we ended last night with Gadamer's own words. Gadamer saying that hermeneutics says that language belongs in dialogue. That is, language is only what it is when it encounters attempts at understanding, when it encounters exchange, and when it encounters speech and counter-speech, when it is answer and question. I want to take that and today move in to look closely at what Gadamer says about language in his 1966 essay, Man and Language. First, though, I should say some background about where this comes from and what's going on with Gadamer in 1966. So Truth and Method was completed in 1960. And Truth and Method is a summation of 25, 30 years of teaching, certainly themes from the previous 20 years of teaching, packaged together into what I think Gadamer thought was sort of his final main statement about his views. I don't think Gadamer at all expected Truth and Method to have the reception it did, to gain the attention it did. And so what happened in the early 60s is all of a sudden Truth and Method was getting a number of reviews, it was being discussed, and Gadamer from about 1964 to 72 then wrote a number of essays, was involved in lots of public discussions of his book, and through this period, the essays from about 64 to 72 become ways in which Gadamer clarifies and spells out and responds to objections that came up around Truth and Method. And it's those essays which then he collected together in volume 2 of his Gesammelte Werke, of his collected works, and he titled that work Truth and Method Volume 2. Right, so it is a continuation of themes in Truth and Method, often done in ways that provide a more explicit explanation of the views he presented in Truth and Method that weren't as clearly presented as maybe he hoped he had, not realizing the kind of response Truth and Method was going to receive from the philosophical world. So Man and Language is just one of those essays. It lays out before us some main themes of what Gadamer has to say about language, in a way that is in some ways clearer and more succinct than anything we get in Truth and Method itself. Gadamer opens the essay by appealing to Aristotle. And he says Aristotle defines human beings as an animal with logos, and says that the proper way to understand logos is not rational, a rational animal, but speech, language. We'll talk in a few minutes where that comes from. I want to focus on where Gadamer is getting this idea from in Aristotle. What Gadamer is doing is just working through Book 1, Part 2 of Aristotle's Politics. Here's what Gadamer has to say. He says, quote, Aristotle once developed the difference between man and animal in the following way. Animals can understand each other by indicating to each other what excites their desire so they can seek it, and what injures them so they can flee from it. That's as far as nature goes. To men alone is the logos given as well, so that they can make manifest to each other what is useful and what is harmful, and therefore also what is right and what is wrong. It's a profound thesis. What is useful and what is harmful is something that is not desirable in itself. Rather, it's desired for the sake of something else not yet given, in whose acquisition it aids one. The distinguishing feature of man, then, is his superiority over what is actually present, his sense of the future. And in the same breath, Aristotle adds, with this sense for right and wrong is given, and all because man, as an individual, has a logos. Here is what Aristotle says, and I think you can see how Gadamer is just reading along with Aristotle in his comments. Aristotle says it is clear why a human is more of a political animal than any bee or any other gregarious animal. For nature does nothing pointlessly. I think the more common translation of that is nature does nothing in vain. And a human being alone among the animals has speech, logos. Now the voice of a signifier is what is pleasant or painful, which is why it is possessed by other animals, but speech, the distinction is between voice and speech. Speech is for making clear what is beneficial or harmful, and so too what is just or unjust. For this is special to humans in comparison to other animals. They alone have perception of the good and the bad, the just and the unjust. So you can see Gadamer is just following along Aristotle and repeating Aristotle's claims that because human beings have speech, our communities are formed differently than other animals who merely have voice. Other animals can point out to other animals, he says, when there is something to be desired or to be feared, but they cannot provide for other animals a sense of what is useful or what is harmful beyond what is immediately present, which he says this is something language can do. And because speech can do this, then it also can talk more abstractly about what is good and bad and what is just and unjust within a society. Gadamer puts a lot of weight on the claim that it's language, it's the logos, that differentiates humans from other animals. He says explicitly, what is more convincing than the fact that the language of animals is entirely different from human language? Now, first, I think we should point out that it's not clear this is what Aristotle is actually saying in this passage. Aristotle is simply saying this is a difference between humans and animals, and there's lots of differences between humans and animals, and just because it's a difference doesn't mean it defines humans, and it's a difference that makes a difference for political exchange and the political organization of society. In fact, we probably should not follow Gadamer along this path with this idea that language defines humans as different from animals, because as we know, as Aristotle didn't know, there are many animals that have versions of languages not all that different from humans. There are animals, for example, blackbirds, who change their vocalizations in order to warn other blackbirds about where a predator is, how far a predator is away. Just to pick one example, and I'm sure we can come up with lots of other examples of other animals that use language in a similar way. In addition, it's known throughout history, it was a common concern about Aristotle's view that if we focus on logos as speech rather than reason, that what you get is a claim that humans who lack speech, are incapable of reason. And then the objection was often made that what about people who are mute? Because it's clear there are people who lack speech who are mute, but just because of that does not mean they're incapable of reasoning. So there's a long discussion, 1,000-year discussion about whether this is actually the case, that the best way to understand the logos is as speech, and what this might say about human beings if we simply restrict it to speech. Elsewhere, Aristotle seems to make clearer that he intends logos as something like reason. You find that in De Anima, you find that in the Nicomachean Ethics. Even there, it might be connected to language, because in the Greek, the word logos has a very diverse meaning. It means speech, it means reason, it means word, as in the beginning of the book of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. That word that is translated as word is logos. It means logic, it means order, it means account. So there are a wide variety of meanings of logos in ancient Greek, and they're interconnected, but it's not clear the core interconnection of all of them is best understood as speech or language. Scholars have often said the conceptual interconnection between these different meanings of logos is best understood as that which unites things without undermining or removing their diversity. So language can do that. We have the word book, for example, and I have a number of books behind me, and we can talk about book and we can refer to books, and by doing so we aren't reducing the books to just one book. It becomes a way of language becomes a way of organizing things conceptually without reducing them, concepts, to the same sort of thing. So I think we should hesitate to follow Gadamer down this path of saying language is speech, logos is speech, and it's the difference between humans and other animals is our ability to use language. But we also look to see where Gadamer gets this idea from, that the best way to interpret logos is to interpret it as language. And for that, we need to turn to Heidegger. So let's move over to the Lightroom and talk a little bit about Heidegger and Heidegger's account of logos as language. Gadamer begins his essay, Man and Language, by turning to Aristotle and Aristotle's classic definition of man as an animal with logos. Now, Gadamer says historically, this has been understood as reason, as a rational animal. But he wants to instead interpret logos as language. So where does he get this idea that we should think about logos as speech, as language? I'm going to look into some of the background for where he got this idea. The source is in Martin Heidegger. Gadamer was taking classes from Heidegger in the early 20s, where Heidegger was working out his account of phenomenology different from Husserl's account of phenomenology. To do so, Heidegger was dividing up phenomenology between the phenomenon and the logos, and analyzing each part of the word. Throughout his lectures in the 20s, he returned to this theme, often returning to Aristotle as a source for how to think about logos in the context of phenomenology. I'm especially interested in, of all things, a lecture course he did on Plato's Sophist. You would think the course would be on Plato, but in fact, the first half of the course is on Aristotle. And this is in the winter of 1924 and 1925. What's interesting about this course is not just that Heidegger talks about logos, but he talks specifically about what it means to do phenomenology from a hermeneutical standpoint. He has this amazing quote. He says, "Philosophical questioning, precisely the one intending to press on to the matters themselves," and you should recognize that phrase, "to the matters themselves," as a version of "to the things themselves," the motto for phenomenology. This questioning is not concerned with freeing us from the past, but on the contrary, with making the past free for us, to liberate us from the tradition, and especially the ungenuine tradition. So Heidegger's point here, and it's a point that Gadamer will share, to investigate a subject matter is not simply to describe it, but it is also, and maybe importantly, and first, to look at the history of the subject matter, to understand the ways in which it has been passed on to us, and to try to free ourselves from the possibly distorted ways in which it has passed on to us. Heidegger also, he continues in the same quote, is arguing for a kind of phenomenological hermeneutics. That is, he says, what remains in history are not systems, but the often difficult to recognize pieces of actual work, which we will grasp as pieces of actually accomplished labor. Genuine communication with the past is to be gained only on this basis. What is he referring to? As a phenomenologist, we are always trying to find words which can render our experiences intelligible to ourselves and to others. And so Heidegger argues that what we need to do in order to get beyond the distorting effects of the tradition is try to return ourselves to the occasions in which these words were first invoked to explain the experiences. This is the labor of finding the word which then conceptualizes the experience. I didn't know what the person might be pointing at when they're pointing at the logos, but this is the idea. You point something out, you come up with the word logos, and Heidegger seeks to recapture that event. And in doing so, we can get beyond the distorting effects of tradition, back to the phenomenological moment when we found the right word for the experience. He continues in the same quotation, "Ruthlessness towards the tradition is reverence toward the past. And the reverence is genuine only in an appropriation of the latter, the past, out of a destruction of the former, the tradition." This is one of the main quotes about destruction, or what later will be called deconstruction of a tradition. And it has this very dramatic opening that we need to be ruthless toward the tradition. And by doing so, we become reverent toward the past. So how does this work in the actual Sophist lectures? Gadamer looks at specifically the logos, and instead of defining it the way the tradition has defined it, as rational, he returns to what he finds in Aristotle, especially in Aristotle's On Interpretation, where logos is understood as speech that discloses something as something. And this, he's going to say, is the original meaning of logos in Aristotle and the core meaning that we should understand today, rather than the received meaning we got distorted through tradition. And that's the background. That's where Gadamer gets the idea. And that's why Gadamer starts the essay with the primary meaning of logos is language. I want to talk a little bit about what I see as limitations to Heidegger's phenomenological approach to hermeneutics. So I think there are three things we need to keep concerned about. The first I call text, and nothing but text. The second I call mining versus refining. And the third I call tradition matters. So here's the first one, text, and nothing but text. The concern is, whatever we say about Aristotle, our only source for this are the actual texts of Aristotle, or perhaps other texts at the time that are talking about Aristotle's views. There's at no point in which we can get beyond the text to what is going on, say, in Aristotle's head, or in Aristotle's actions, or Aristotle's choices. And this is the case for any hermeneutic approach that sees the meanings as presented as texts as just vehicles for arriving at interpretation of something else, for example, somebody else's intentions. So since we only have the texts to make sense of Aristotle's views, we're really not adding anything by saying we're also trying to understand what was going on with Aristotle, what experiences was he trying to articulate when he came up with the terms he came up with. As what more is there to do than to look at the words in the text and see how he uses them. The second concern, I talk about mining versus refining. Let's talk about Aristotle again. There are certain words in Aristotle, like energeia. This word, which we translate as actuality, does not have an existence in Greek before Aristotle. He coined this term. I thought I'd call it mining rather than coining because it works better. But the idea is that he came up with this term, this technical term, in order to explain something that he felt needed explaining, that the word did not exist before him in Greek. All right, so this is a case where it makes sense to ask what is missing in the Greek philosophical lexicon that Aristotle has to add a new word, energeia. It's a different situation when we're talking about logos. The word logos had existed for hundreds and hundreds of years before Aristotle. By the time Aristotle came to it, it had a wide variety of meanings. Aristotle wasn't trying to coin a new word to explain a theory or an experience. Aristotle was taking the meanings that had been around for hundreds of years and trying to refine them to get at the core meaning of them. It's something that Aristotle does in most of his texts, because Aristotle, more than, say, Plato, takes for granted that the commonly held meanings have a kernel of truth in them. In fact, the oldest meaning we have, this is sort of an interesting side point, the oldest meaning we have of logos, going back to Homeric time and poems, that this was now 300-400 years before Aristotle, is the idea of a persuasive speech specifically done by women or by cowardly men who, instead of appropriately fighting, tried to talk themselves out of trouble, tried to persuade their husbands using speech, and always in contrast to the courageous men who understood it was time to battle. One exception was Odysseus, who used logos, but Odysseus is famous for the ways in which he used persuasion to get himself out of situations in ways that were tricky and maybe not always admirable. In Aristotle's actual time, if we look at the way logos is used across documents, not just in the philosophical documents at Aristotle's time, what we find is sort of the common theme of logos. It could mean order, it could mean logic, it could mean word, it could mean reason, it could mean language. What they shared in common at the time was the idea that these are things which unify while preserving the differences. This is sort of the core meaning you find across all these different accounts of logos. And Aristotle's case is that rational speech, then, is the best way, the way to refine those variety meanings to capture the core sense, philosophically, of logos. My third concern is what I will call tradition matters. Let's look at Heraclitus. Say we decide we're going to go back to an earlier philosophical time. We're going to go back a couple hundred years. And we're going to look at the way that Heraclitus introduces terms in order to try and find more cases of mining or coining terms rather than just refining terms that are already in the common usage. So here's a quote from Heraclitus: "How can one hide from that which never sets?" And it's a quote that Heidegger spends a lot of time carefully analyzing. But although the quote is ascribed to Heraclitus, we don't actually have any original writings of Heraclitus. The quote really comes from Clement of Alexandria. And Clement of Alexandria lived in the Common Era, around 200 Common Era 700 years after Heraclitus. So this quote, "How can one hide from that which never sets?" only emerges 700 years after Heraclitus. We have no other record of the existence of the quote. Now you might say, well, Clement of Alexandria, of all the church fathers, he was the one who was most educated in Greek philosophy, and he's in all places. He's in Alexandria. There is the library there. You think if anyone might have access to Heraclitus' actual quotes, it might be Clement of Alexandria. But what we know is that there are other quotes. Clement liked to quote Heraclitus a lot. There were other thinkers who had similar quotes as Clement of Heraclitus, and we find that Clement's quotes tend to be less reliable, or more likely to be the outlier than other people's quotes. So he maybe is not the most reliable presenter of Heraclitus' views. In fact, the only reason we have this quote is that Clement is talking about a religious idea that God is always present in our soul. And then to buttress his view, he points to Heraclitus and says, it's like what Heraclitus said, "How can one hide from that which never sets?" If it wasn't for that specific theological convergence that Clement saw between his own religious views and Heraclitus, we would have no record of this quote. So to say that we're going to try to get beyond the tradition to what Heraclitus actually did when he came up with this quote suggests that we have reliable access to the quote, right? That isn't itself, its very existence is shaped by tradition and meaning. And in that respect, I want to say that tradition matters. And tradition matters in a way that we may have to think about whether the phenomenological hermeneutics of Heidegger is really the best way to go about understanding the text. So these are my three concerns that I have about Heidegger's phenomenological approach to hermeneutics. I want to get them on the table in the front before we turn to Gadamer, who I don't think makes any of these mistakes. So the first thing that Gadamer wants to say about language, what language does, is it makes manifest. And he uses the same word when he talks about Aristotle. And when Aristotle says what language separates us from other animals, is it makes manifest the ways in which things could be useful or useless, independent upon the ways they may factor into our desires. So let's think about an example of that. What exactly does it mean for language to make something manifest? Well, here's one possibility. Let's say you are heading into the Art Institute in Chicago, and you go and you see the Seurat painting, a pointillist painting, Sunday on the Grand Jet. And there is this painting, and you're taking it all in, and you're there with a friend, and the friend says, "Did you notice the hats?" Right? Immediately, your attention is going to be drawn to the hats, and there's many hats in this painting that you might not have noticed had it not been the case that somebody said to you, "Did you notice the hats?" So it's a way in which language can turn our attention, our visual attention in this case, but it could be sound, it could be it's any of our senses, can turn our senses in a way that we attend to something we might not have attended to otherwise. And of course we have the word hat, the concept of a hat, that allows us to pick up things in our environment that draw our attention to it. So that's one way in which language can manifest something. It can literally draw our senses to focus on certain things in our environment. Another way in which language might make things manifest for us, again, using the same example, say this friend says, "And notice that nobody is looking at each other. I wonder what that means." So here's a different sort of question. First, we are directed to attend to the ways in which all their faces manifesting themselves, pointing in different directions. But then a question is manifest, a thought, an idea is manifest. We ask, what is it that this is trying to say, that all these faces are looking in different kinds of directions? So this is a way in which something is manifest not simply to our senses, but to our intellect. Right? An idea is being presented to us, a question, a thought is being made manifest, a certain question about what we're seeing is now made manifest through our experience. So now we experience this painting in a new way. We experience this painting as offering us a kind of question and offering us a kind of meaning that might answer that question. There's another way that language might make things manifest. So imagine you are a Broadway fan and you've seen the show by Stephen Sondheim, Sunday in the Park with George, which is a Broadway musical based on George Seurat and this very painting, the Sunday on the Grangette. And in that piece, there is a song called Finishing the Hat, one of Sondheim's more famous songs. And in that song, the singer, George Seurat, is regretting lost loves and the way that loves did not wait for him, in the same way that when he focuses on his paintings, the characters of his paintings always wait for him. And as he looks out the window, both to get an understanding of what the sky looks like so he can paint it, he also realizes there's a kind of life out there that he is missing because he is focusing so much on his artistic production, and that's interfering with him actually living his life. It's often seen as a stand-in for Sondheim himself, focusing all his energy on his artistic productions and maybe missing out of living in the process. But the song ends with, "Look at this hat, I made a hat that was not there before." So in the end, part of the theme of the song is, but still, I brought something into existence that never existed before and couldn't have existed without me. And say you are a Broadway fan and you've heard this song and you know the musical, but you've never seen the painting before. And you go in, and now the painting has a new kind of significance, has a new context and a new meaning, right, which gives it a whole different sense for you than it would be for someone who doesn't have that background, right? In this case, focusing on the hats means something different than for the other person where he said, look at the hats, and you notice the hats. For you, the hats have this sort of sad symbolism. And odd things could happen because of that make perfect sense. Someone may walk into the room and say, that doesn't look like Bernadette Peters at all. And you know what that means. That is a kind of understanding of the painting that could never have happened before this musical happened. And it is something true about the painting. It is something that the painting now manifests for people who have had that background. And it says something then really interesting about what language can do, in the way language creates a kind of social reality that gives us a background set of concepts, gives us a background set of experiences that then we take with us as we perceive the world. And these concepts and these experiences and these associations are present in our experiences, so that we look at the painting and we see there's the sadness. There's somebody who does not look like Bernadette Peters. Right? And so this becomes a really fascinating thing I want to focus in on, and that is the way that language activates our conceptual resources in perception. At this point, after 2.5 days of discussing these topics, we're in a really clear position about what we mean when we say that language actualizes our conceptual capacities in perception. Think of the first day when we talked about understanding and the way in which we exist in an understanding way, interacting with the world. Things disclose themselves to us as things to be interacted with in certain ways, often unconsciously, right? And this reflects a certain comportment understanding of our interaction with the world. And on the second day, we talked about how language operates, right? Language operates in a way that we can bring things to consciousness through language. Charles Taylor was explicit. There is a kind of reason connected to language in a very specific way. That is when we find the words to express and make something intelligible, and in doing so, bring it to realization, to manifestation, to consciousness through concepts. And we talked about the ways in which that works, has connections to phenomenology, and how in the hermeneutic critique of phenomenology, when we find words to convey our experiences, we are bringing those experiences to conscious awareness. We are not just simply taking something that we are aware of otherwise and then finding the right word for it. The word, the language, is constitutive of our awareness of the object, of the nature of the object. So here, when we get this kind of language, language operates because we are interacting with the world, and one of the ways in which we interact with the world as linguistic beings is the world calls forth our use of concepts, inviting us to respond to it conceptually through language. So language becomes a way in which our concepts are actualized to function in perception to make sense of our world. And it's not necessarily a secondary activity, something that only happens when other things break down, right? It is a fundamental way in which we engage the world as beings who seek to make sense of the world through language. So that is the third way, in some ways the crucial way in which language operates through perception. We may even say, rather dramatically, but I think in an exciting way, language itself is a faculty of perception. Okay, in just a moment I'd like to take a break. But first let me mention quickly the next point Gadamer makes in his essay, and that is that language operates in a self-forgetting way. I think it should be clear now that we've emphasized how much language functions perceptually and conceptually in our fundamental understanding and engagement of the world. It makes perfect sense that language happens behind the scenes in the state of self-forgetting. It is rare when we become aware of how language is actually functioning. But it's also important to become aware of how language is functioning, because language shapes so much of how we understand the world. It reminds me of a joke that was made famous by David Foster Wallace in a commencement address he gave. Here it is.
There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?"
Now, that is not just a random example. Gadamer himself says, and this is a quote, "We exist in language as fish exist in water." Okay, with that in mind, let's take a break. We can process all of this, stand up, stretch, and come back in 5 minutes. We're going to turn to language as dialogue, and then we're actually going to engage in some dialogue.